Hello, and welcome to Saros's webinar on M&A. I see we've had a lot of people registering, and I see they're currently coming in and joining, and I'm sure more will join as we go on. Yeah. But we're just going to get started on this. Just to introduce Saros for those that don't know, we're an IT consulting and project management firm with locations in the UK, Ireland, and Switzerland. We work globally with multinational customers across multiple sectors, including pharmaceuticals, retail, finance, energy, technology, as well as many others. We also consult in many areas, including M&A, this topic, service transition, cyber, digital, and AI, to name but a few. And we also deliver projects globally and considered a safe pair of hands. So I'd like to welcome you again to the event, Integration Without Friction, the secret to synergy and M&A. Most of us, I presume, on the call have been involved with M&As in one way or another. Certainly our guests have. They can be complex, they can be difficult, and IT is generally the last to know about them. So, we need to have well-planned pre and post-merger activities for successful M&A for the business to achieve the outcomes. We have some great guests to talk about their experiences, and it should be really insightful today, having spoken with them before. There's some great knowledge there. Today, our facilitator is Deirdre McArdle. She's a seasoned copywriter and journalist specializing in the tech industry. She has a rich portfolio ranging from case studies and thought leadership to white papers, and she brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to our discussion. Her unique insights into the IT sector make her the perfect guide for today's topic. With that, I will hand you over to Deirdre.
Thank you, Justin. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Over the next hour or so, we're going to have a nice, relaxed roundtable discussion about the complex world of mergers and acquisitions. Our four panelists, who have decades of experience in this area, will share their insights with you, with a particular focus on the challenges organizations face at the pre-merger and post-merger phases, and how organizations can identify these challenges early on and why it's so important to do so, and the strategies they can employ to achieve a successful outcome. So before we go any further, let me introduce our expert panels. So we have Marie Lanigan. Marie is a change management consultant at Saros Consulting with over 20 years experience in managing multiple debt reduction programs for a global manufacturing client involving significant change management projects. Garrett Finlay is a senior program management consulting at Saros Consulting. He has decades of experience leading change in public and private sector organizations and manages a global network program for a leading retailer. Gavin Hand is head of data, digital and integration at Excel Group. Gavin has vast experience in managing complex M&As, guiding successful transactions on the buy and sell side. And Tom Byrne is a strategic technology executive and M&A advisor. Tom has extensive experience leading organizations through successful M&A cycles with a focus on tech due diligence, system consolidation, and post-merger integration. As Justin explained, or Justin said earlier on, and as we all know, I'm sure, a successful merger and acquisition isn't only about aligning that balance sheet. It requires a strategic approach to people, systems, and culture. I think one of the things that is certain about any M&A activity is that there will be challenges. So with that in mind, I'm going to just throw it out to the panel here about these challenges. So what are the main pitfalls or friction points that organizations will uncover or encounter at the pre-merger phase? How important is it that they identify those early on, and how can they get ahead of them then? So maybe Gavin, if you want to jump in on this, and we kind of maybe keep it as a nice casual conversation. So if anyone feels like they want to jump in at any point, you can do so. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think, look, uncertainty is something that everyone involved in this needs to be comfortable with, right? The level of uncertainty when deals are announced is high on both sides. And that really tends to affect people, and people are probably the most important part of any successful M&A activity. So the early relationships you build are critical. People are dealing with uncertainty on their future, uncertainty in the data they're reviewing, uncertainty as to what the potential impact is going to be. So first and foremost, having the right people there that are capable of dealing with it, uncertainty, are comfortable with it, are able to build relationships quickly, build trust early, are critical. The other side of the challenge is the uncertainty around data. There's never enough data received by either party during these types of transactions. So understanding what you can rely on, understanding where you may have gaps, and being comfortable with that is critical for me. I think as the program starts, Justin mentioned earlier, you're dealing with a lot of people being brought into a program probably later than they should be. So getting that team ready, building those relationships and connecting those people is essential to actually start moving to a point where you can start to deal with some of those challenges.
And Tom, thank you, Gavin. Tom, as well as the people, you know, we will talk about this a little bit later on, because you know, as we go through, it will become clear, I think, hopefully to our attendees, that people are paramount here, and the change management piece is a huge talking point. But let's kind of roll it back a little bit and talk a little, if you wouldn't mind, about the IT due diligence side. So how important is that at the early stage, and what can come up here at this stage, and what could prove problematic if it isn't handled early?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think, you know, even there's probably a couple of phases to consider before you even get to due diligence, and I think that's the inception of everything that's happening. And quite often, as the guys have already said, you know, technology or IT are usually the last to know. But if we think about the very beginning of all of any kind of transaction, it really starts with, you know, developing a plan and a strategic set of objectives for going after an acquisition or a merger. I think, you know, having a very clear understanding about the rationale for the acquisition, whether it's expanding market share or entering new markets or acquiring new technology to either complement or give you a new go-to-market offering, is really important, because understanding all of that is something that needs to weave its way right through the cycle. You know, once that's very clear to the folks involved, I think if IT can get involved even in that stage of the process, it certainly helps things move smoother, because as you move into the due diligence phase, it's easier to start to build a view of what's really important in this transaction. And, you know, within the due diligence stage, you know, you need to think about, you know, what the target company's value is, you know, what risks are there, compatibility with your own organization if you're acquiring a company. And from a technology perspective, then it helps to have a very clear playbook outlined in terms of what you want to understand. So things like cyber, I think Justin mentioned earlier on in the call, are really important. So it's important to understand what level of cybersecurity maturity your target acquisition company may have already. If you're an organization that's heavily regulated, if you're in the payments industry, you're subject to PCI or a number of other regulations. You know, as soon as you acquire a company, you're on the hook for that organization as well as your own. So if they've got a very low level of maturity, it may mean you need to factor in added focus to bring their audit to a better place and ensure you don't lose your certifications. From a tech perspective, you know, the landscape that you inherit can be in various shapes and forms. It could be, you know, could have been under investment for a number of years. You could be inheriting a lot of technical debt. And the reality there is, you know, you need to fully understand that at the due diligence phase, because you need to understand exactly what you're going to buy, the financial costs associated with that, to perhaps keep that environment alive and running as you integrate your organizations. And sometimes that gets missed along the way. So when it comes to structuring the deal and valuation, quite often, you know, there can be a lot of hidden costs that, if technology are not involved in the discussion, can be overlooked by the folks who are, you know, preparing and structuring the finance elements of the deal. I I think the people element is, Gavin's absolutely right. They're at the core of everything that happens. But I believe in the pre-merger or acquisition stage, having technology on the field as soon as possible to help influence some of those discussions is really important.
It sounds like, so it's about, and Gavin, you said this earlier on, it's about having the right people in the room as early as possible. Garrett, would you go along with that? And if so, who are the right people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to have the senior business team and the senior tech teams, working hand in glove together, because without that, business decisions can be made without understanding the technical complexities, the timeframes and the costs. And as was discussed, the piece around the due diligence, in my experience, it's not often 100% right first time. It's an iterative process. As you delve further into any kind of an integration or a merger, you suddenly find there's not additional tech debt, additional complexity that wasn't immediately apparent at the beginning, which can have a big outcome in terms of budget, in terms of timeline. You may have, regulatory timelines. To Tom's point, if you're in a regulated industry, you may only have a set amount of time to get the joint house in order. So it can have big impact if you find there's a technical debt you weren't aware of, which delays those things. You could be facing fines and all sorts of other things. So I think that the key is the engagement we've already discussed, but it has to be an iterative process. There has to be an understanding on both sides that we don't know it all right now. There has to be an allowance for the fact that these plans may need to be tweaked, may need to be changed. The other key piece is just communication, because every part of the organization will be affected, and people can feel disenfranchised if they don't feel like they know what's going on. To make this a success, everybody has to be on that journey together. Management styles in terms of communications can differ. So it can't be just, pass it down to the next layer, pass it down to the next layer. It has to be, a very collaborative approach to communicating to make sure that everybody understand what it means, what's expected of them. Obviously, there's the human factors that we discussed. People, may be concerned about job security and all those kinds of things. Another aspect, of course, is you've got a vendor ecosystem, and the vendor ecosystem could be different depending on the parties. You could end up in a situation where the vendors are even competing with one another. So that's another part of the kind of complexity to be managed, and communication is going to be key to managing that complexity.
Yeah, I think that's clear. Anne-Marie, you are very much about the change management side of things and taking a people-focused approach to any project, whether it's a large-scale project or an M&A, which in effect is essentially a large project, very large. But what we do know, I suppose, with M&A activity or M&A success outcomes or successful outcomes, like there's a McKinsey report that suggests that 70% of M&A failures are attributed to cultural differences. Like, that's a huge number, and for something that maybe a lot of organizations aren't particularly focusing on, or maybe not aware of it. So I'm going to ask this question, but I think I know the answer to it. How important is it that you get on top of that early on, as early as possible into the activity itself?
Yeah, I think that is really a key thing that lots of people forget. People are having these senior leadership meetings, discussing financials and various things. Much as Tom said, the technology is incredibly important, but the people are a huge factor, because a lot of failures come from people not adopting the changes. So if you don't bring them on board, excuse me, early enough, and you don't let them know what to expect, because we're all humans, we all have this idea of what's in it for me, how will it affect me, how will it impact my life on a daily basis. So what tends to happen if you don't engage is rumor mills start, People kind of put their own stories together of what they think is going to happen. And really, to go back to the planning stage, again, you know, people don't seem to understand who the stakeholders are. As Garrett said, the stakeholders, you know, it's not just the employees, it's the vendors, it's the vendor relationships, it's various contractual things that you have going on in those vendor relationships. And then you've got the customers, because ultimately the show must go on. So all of this can be happening in the background. You've got shareholders. If shareholders don't feel that it's being managed correctly, you know, people get nervous. That can have a detrimental impact financially. So the people management and kind of, first of all, doing your stakeholder analysis and a SWOT analysis is key. And that can be done alongside the negotiations and discussions, as long as you bring in the correct people. A lot of the times, you know, with any changes, there is an emotional side. Sure, the Kubler-Ross goes through the emotional stages. It's almost like a grief process. When people are faced with uncertainty and various things, you only have to look to COVID and what it did to people, this change that nobody could control. Quite often, you may find that you lose some of your key personnel, some of your strongest people, because that uncertainty drives them to go and find a more certain space. I think the key of that is ensuring that you have individuals coming in and looking at the key stakeholder analysis, independent individuals who, you know, they've not got these personal relationships. They're looking for how do we retain the correct people to ensure that this is a success, whilst managing potential grief processes around things like redundancies, which can all be a fallout of mergers and acquisitions.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would imagine, like with these, you're talking there about the impact or the effect on the workforce, and about being able to retain key staff. But if you're coming in, say if two organizations are merging together, what strategies can they employ to identify those personnel, identify the areas of focus? Like there's obviously at the very early stage, at the pre-merger stage, or even before, Tom or Gavin, maybe you can come in here, but there's the opportunities for consolidation here and rationalization. So that's obviously an issue that comes up. How, you know, how important is that? And is, you know, further down the line, obviously we're talking about consolidation of IT as well, but obviously we're talking about consolidation of two separate entities coming in, and there's going to be some rationalization there.
Yeah, I think, look, consolidation is always required, right? If you want to drive shareholder value, you don't have duplicate functions, right? So everyone knows that on both sides, everyone up and down the organization. I think when you're you know, even at the due diligence stage, you need to be looking at, obviously you've got your targets and you build your plan and you have your integration deadlines, and they may be driven by, you know, regulatory dates. You know, these are dates that can't move. It's not a typical project. If you're closing, you're closing. I think the key is, obviously you need to assess the team on an ongoing basis. And the way I approach it would be, I'm not looking to hit an integration or day one or day two. I'm looking to see longer term, what opportunity does this bring for me to drive maybe initiatives that I didn't have momentum on prior to this acquisition. So looking forward, looking for potential transformation activities that can actually accelerate the organization as a whole. So you're not just looking at people to fit into what your target operating model is going to be. You're really looking to identify people that can help maybe drive further transformation. And long term, what's the talent pool look like? You know, is this a leader I want to see as, you know, part of the organization in future? And likewise, there is an element of okay, you look at particular functions and maybe there is duplication. So you are looking to see the capabilities of people, but also the cultural fit. And that's not to say you would decide, I'm keeping this person or I'm getting rid of that person. You really need to look at it as a whole, because you're getting a talent pool. It might not exactly fit with what your current organization is. It might not fit with your current way of thinking, but there's value there, and you know, repositioning people within an organization is key, and evaluating that at all stages with a forward-facing view to see what transformation can I deliver here. Post-integration is critical for me.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of that post-integration phase, or maybe actually, so yeah, I suppose let's moving on through. So like what I'm getting here is that the planning phase shouldn't be rushed. Tom, I think we've spoken before, and I think maybe it was you that talked about that, like a shallow surface level due diligence isn't enough. It has to be thorough. So it can't be, for want of a better term, half-assed. So maybe talk to me about like the strategies or kind of methodologies that are going to be so essential here in making sure that phase, that everything that can be covered has been covered. Are there particular ways that companies or organizations need to go about that, and how do they do so? Yeah,
I think, look, I mentioned a playbook earlier on. I mean, one of the methods I've used myself is I've created a charter for integration, similar to what you would create as, you know, as an IT leader in the business. You'd create your IT charter, and part of that would be to, you know, to level set the expectations from the business, but also from IT, of what this is all about. I think it's an opportunity to really clearly set out what IT will deliver as part of this activity. But what's most important for me in that is actually getting commitment from the business to what they need to do in order for this to be successful. Because, you know, regardless of what stage of the cycle, I think quite often it's left to IT to figure it out. You know, so when you combine that with being late into the process, it can be difficult to kind of course correct. And I think, you know, Gavin, you touched on something there that's really important, and it's easy to overlook it in the due diligence phase. You know, you think about data and access, right? So you talk about, you know, how are we going to get the data from the company that we're going to buy? Are they willing to share it all? Can we trust the data that we're being given? You need to mind that to understand the hidden liabilities here that we don't necessarily understand from a technical perspective. You know, have we got everything that we need? Are there undisclosed contracts somewhere that maybe we'll be on the hook for as part of some sort of agreement post-deal that haven't been disclosed? So there's a level of, you know, making sure that you've got all of that information. There's obviously a tech architecture review that you would do to understand, you know, how platforms are built and what you're inheriting. But there's a really important cultural due diligence step that needs to understand, you know, the people, but also the cultures and values of the target organization that are going to be acquired. Because I think it's good to understand if that has any kind of alignment with your existing organization. If it doesn't, is it something that you can bring together and create maybe a new set of cultures and values? But quite often I've seen that overlooked in the due diligence phase, because the focus tends to be very much on the technology element of it, and then structuring the financial deal and figuring out, right, how we're going to take this to market and ultimately drive revenue. But the knock-on effect of not doing that in the right way is ultimately that you don't realize those synergies that you expect during the integration phase. And you could end up then with, you know, revenue misses or potential cost savings where there's probably unrealistic expectations in terms of how quickly the consolidation phase can happen. So, like I said, building that, having a very clear set of objectives, building a charter, having everybody involved in the cycle on the business side, understanding that yes, IT can deliver, you know, a certain number of this, but we actually need the business to commit to the following in order for it to happen. And you know, we shouldn't be afraid to call out things like that cultural due diligence and understanding the workforce that you're going to join. It's one that gets overlooked. So that playbook is really important. When we talk about, like, again, Garrett, you wrote on a blog there recently about, we were talking about tech debt, and you were talking about known tech debt,
which can emerge in that IT due diligence phase, let's say pre-merger. But then there's always going to be that unknown tech debt that doesn't really pop up or doesn't really kind of rear its head until things are bedded down a little bit. Can you talk to me a little bit more about that, and how you said earlier on, I think when you were speaking about is how important it is to have a degree of inbuilt flexibility so that you kind of roll with the punches a bit on that?
Yeah, 100%, Deirdre, because as I mentioned earlier, you just don't know what you don't know when you set out. And it's as you move through the process, you uncover more and more, you learn more about really what you're dealing with, really, the complexities, understanding, where the merging organizations are in their maturity, understanding, what levels of tech debt they have. You're also starting to navigate what the culture is like, because, you're bringing two different cultures together, right? And sometimes even at the outset, you're not really sure how that's going to play out. It could work out fantastically, better than you expected, or it could be the opposite, I think, one of the key parts of this is that, technology is always evolving, but human nature remains more or less the same. Everybody still has their hopes and dreams and fears. And, this just creates this uncertainty. It creates opportunity. And that goes, as I said earlier, for the vendors as well involved in this, because they could have quite a lot of skin in the game in one or both camps. I think another key piece is, and Tom and Gavin both alluded to the cybersecurity aspects of this, and that is that that's only as strong as the weakest link. And, if one party isn't so strong, if one party has an outsourced vendor, then suddenly your perimeter's out there now. Does that start to affect your information security management system and your adherence to that if you're certified against whatever standards? So an awful lot of stuff can start to come out of the woodwork as you move through the process. And this kind of a journey is always full of surprises. But I think what's key is to go into it knowing that you don't know everything, be adaptable to cope with the change, and then collectively have the experience to know, well, look, whatever comes up, we'll deal with it, and just move forward.
Mm-hmm.
Garrett, sorry, Garrett,
go ahead, Anne-Marie.
Just on that point, actually, because it kind of came up for me there. I suppose a lot of organisations don't have a full understanding of their own technical debt in order to be able to disclose to another what that technical debt looks like. And I think that's the piece where you need to have some kind of contingency in there. You need to have that real critical planning, because we work with a lot of organizations who are global, and people are adding bits of tech on, applications are maybe not being upgraded, and until you do due diligence within each organization on that, even they wouldn't understand necessarily what their technical debt looks like. And then the vendor point that you brought before, if anyone has ever tried to move from one vendor to another, you also have that, I won't say the word reluctance, but that's what it is. If a vendor is potentially no longer going to be working with a client and has to hand that over to someone else, there generally isn't that thorough handover, human nature being what it is, and business going forward, their investment is limited because they know they're not going to be a vendor for that company anymore. So that handover, even there, needs to be hugely carefully managed.
Yeah, very much. And I think there's a real danger there to lose the corporate memory, because when you have systems in there for a long time, if you have flight risk of staff, or indeed, if you've had a strategic partnership with vendors for over a long period of time, there's a huge amount of corporate memory that they have about your business that can be lost. And sadly, quite often we look at the cost of these things, but not the value, and we don't realize what we've lost until it's too late. And sometimes that doesn't manifest itself until further down the track, where you start to see your customer service is dropping, or your shareholder confidence is dropping, whatever. So we don't, things we do at each stage have effects later on. And I think it's just with experience that you expect the unexpected. And I think it's all about asking as many questions as you can possibly think of, because we definitely don't know the answers, but we can come up with hopefully what are the right questions that will flush out those right answers from those vendors, from all the key business stakeholders, from the technical teams, to try and flush out and build as good a picture as we possibly can about the tech landscape, including the tech debt, including any of the the ticking time bombs. We know that system's gone end of life and it's on extended maintenance, etc. All those kinds of things that can really derail projects and add cost and add money, or sorry, time and cost rather.
Just to expand on the cybersecurity side of it, because in my experience, I've never seen two organizations that have genuinely similar maturity levels there. And during an M&A deal, one, it's the biggest area of risk, and it's also the most expensive to remediate and align. Organizations typically, you might have another system where you have two merging entities that have two different systems that may lend itself to moving to potentially a third system that actually serves both organizations. But typically for cyber security, the level of appetite for that is low. So generally it's one organization tends to have to adjust to another. And it's only experience that kind of gives you the insight on as part of due diligence, and also preparing for integration. With experience, you get a feel for what those costs could potentially be, and you need to introduce those early, because a lot of contracts in that space are long, they're expensive, and when you're trying to align contracts, and we touched on it a couple of times, contracts can vary wildly. You can have a contract with one company that was signed in Europe and another signed in America that have significant differences in them. So bringing the right people to those conversations with the right experience is essential.
100%.
As we move through the process, then when we kind of enter into the post-merger, the integration phase, Tom, there's a lot of work then that kind of ends up maybe at the doorstep of IT. And so we're looking at a situation where, often in these mergers or acquisitions, the parties aren't equal. So there's and there can be incompatible tech, and there can be existing legacy tech that's that's ancient and needs to be maybe kind of looked at. What are the key areas here, the kind of key problems in the IT space or the tech space that can emerge at this stage, and how do organizations go about kind of, I suppose, trying to incorporate, let's say, largely incompatible systems or legacy tech that needs to be maybe streamlined or brought up to speed and to match maybe the other party?
I think there's for me, as with any project, right, it starts around having a very clear scope of what the objective and timelines, priorities will be. So it's helpful to get an understanding from the business about what their expectations are here, right? Because from an IT perspective, it's easy for us to take a step back and say, right, well, everybody's going to have the same email address. We're going to migrate all of our data to the same cloud tenant. Pick your favorite. It's easy to dive straight into that, but quite often what can be misaligned is the business may have a different set of expectations in terms of how they want to go to market with the newly acquired company. There's probably cross-sell opportunities. There's maybe integrations between systems that need to happen, and they may take priority over other technical integration tasks, because if they don't happen, then you end up with revenue misses based on what's forecasted on those objectives. So I think having a very clear set of objectives about what's the goal here and how quickly do you want us to move. I think it's important to have, once you have that high level set of objectives, you really need to have a really clear assessment of the IT landscape in both organizations, You know, identify those critical systems that need to be integrated as part of the business plans. You know, just to kind of link back into that cyber risk space, understanding where maybe there's deficiencies in terms of threat and vulnerability management, or you know, are you acquiring a company that hasn't done any security patching for the last year? You know, you're now bringing that into your environment. So I think, Garrett, you said it, you're only as good as your weakest point, right? So having a full understanding of what both landscapes look like and how you bring them both to a level set, build that integration roadmap and a very clear plan and timelines that links back to what the business objectives are. I think you've got to be able to prioritize operational support in both organizations, because you know the lights need to remain on, and that's ultimately the foundation that you build upon. You've got to have conversations around resourcing as well, because something that I've encountered is that it just feels like something that, well, IT can just do this, right? And quite oftenly, you know, IT departments are quite lean. They're probably quite busy keeping the lights on. So make sure that you're ring fencing capacity for the implementation plan that you've set out and agreed with the business. Something that I've seen help as well is having a level of independence to drive the integration project, because, you know, going back to the cultural side of things, you know, quite often when companies are acquired, there's uncertainty. There's probably a very, you know, they're very proud of their heritage. You know, they've probably worked together for a long time. They firmly believe the way they've done things is the right way to do things, just like most companies. So I think they're the kind of things that you need to consider when you're planning this out, and having somebody independent in the mix that doesn't feel like they're driving an agenda from one side or the other can help bring the integration forward. You know, I think that's something that definitely helps. But having that really clear plan, set of objectives is really important. I noticed in the chat that Peter sent a message around risk management. I think in that integration phase, I think it's really important to have, I guess, that very detailed integration plan, have right level of governance around the integration program. You know, there's obviously a lot of technical work that needs to happen, but I do think you need to have the right engagement with the business, different stakeholders of the business at a governance level to make sure that they understand where things are at. They can often help overcome the cultural challenges that you have and make sure you've got consistent messaging. But I think, you know, Peter, to your question, it's really about the detailed plan, big focus on that change management piece that we talked about earlier on. And I think it's really important to then actually, you know, look at the expected synergies that I talked about a little bit earlier that sometimes get identified in due diligence, and measure if they're actually still on track or if they need to be readjusted, and maybe an expectation needs to be reset with the business then. But, you know, having that view, but having the right governance structure around the integration program is really important as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to do what if scenarios as well, Tom, in terms of this, because it's such an unknown. You know, you need to, I think it's always helpful to have people from different parts of the business that you don't necessarily think might be impacted. They can sometimes be the ones that bring the magic question, what if this should happen and what if that should happen? And if you can create your initial risk assessment based on the what ifs, and then you can build on that from there. You're not going to find all the risk straight away, but certainly it's a starting point.
Absolutely, yeah.
Anne-Marie, it as well, I think, with knowing the people, but the right people to ask, by which I mean, so your frontline users, or your, you know, kind of the people who are managing the operations day to day, are often going to have a wealth of knowledge about what works, what doesn't work, where are the problems, the kind of little minutiae details that mightn't kind of come up in a large scale, you know, due diligence search, but is information that's kind of vital, but it's very specific Like, can you maybe just chat a little bit about that, about how important it is to really have that communication with from the ground up, really, that you're kind of really understanding the minutiae there.
100%. Like you have experts in all of their fields, and that's the way you need to understand the people who are working within the organisation. And so many times I've seen decisions being made in organisations at a very, very senior level, and it comes in and it's like, just do it. And no one sits and end-to-ends the process. Will it work? Will it work with all of the, say, for instance, the manufacturing plant? Will it work with all of the machines that they're using? Can we bring their technologies in? By having those people involved in the earlier conversations, they can easily identify in 5 minutes, guys, this isn't going to work for you. And it can stop you going down a rabbit hole of a decision that at top level seemed, oh, it makes sense. And it's not technologically possible when you get down to someone who's on the front line. So I think hearing those voices, and the tendency with mergers and acquisitions is to keep things kind of quiet, keep it really quiet. And then when it becomes public knowledge, quick rush merge. And that planning, it can be seen as a big cost, it can be seen as a big overhead, but that can be your difference between success and failure. And listening to the people who you employ on a daily basis to be experts in their role. The other, and I suppose the other side of it is where people feel heard, they feel involved. And when they feel involved, they feel engaged and they feel acknowledged and valued. So you're doing there's a double edge to that. They're helping you and you're also keeping them engaged and feeling valued whilst the change happens.
That's hugely important, Marie.
Because I suppose, Tom, I think you all mentioned it at certain points, but like we're doing all of this, like there's a huge kind of work going on in terms of integrating the two companies. But at the end of the day, operations, the lights, as you said, Tom, still have to remain on. It has to be business as usual. We don't want to be in a situation, or organizations don't want to be in a situation where there's broken customer experience, or products fail to be sent out, like the things break down. So there's a huge amount of work that's going on, that's always been going on, and then you're adding this extra layer on. So it's about that business continuity piece. If we could maybe if I could go around all four of you actually, and maybe if you could kind of pull out where you think the challenges are in that area, like about that, and how that impacts the different departments or the different areas of the business in terms of the burden that's going to come on them to integrate the two entities while also running the business. Maybe Gavin, if I could start with you, please.
Yeah, I think, look, we touched on customer experience, which absolutely has to be maintained, and that's where your revenue's coming from. But it's can be easy to forget about the smaller departments, different parts of the organization that maybe haven't had as strong a voice in the deal, and experience for those users, particularly where you have an acquisition that's maybe one-sided, as in I'm buying a company and you're just going to move to our systems, and it's going to be painful for a period of 3 to 6 months. I've seen decisions like that made, again, at a high level that aren't, to Anne-Marie's point, considering the operational side of it. And the impact of those can be significant on the outcome, what the organization looks like at the end, because you're effectively showcasing what the future is going to be as you work through this program. So if you're not focused on the experience of the acquired company, or even significant departments in that company, that starts to chip away at trust, and it undermines, even if you do have a solid change program that's properly managed, if you're not delivering and you're not listening to people, and you know, you might not be able to deliver, but if you're not communicating to them properly and actively showing progress towards improving that creates, or that maintains potentially a level of distrust, and could result in disillusionment and you know, strong people leaving the organization. So as much as you focus on the customer, you know, don't forget your internal customers. Make sure that the people are getting the best experience they can, and where they're not getting it, they understand why and when they will get it.
Mm-hmm. Tom, I'm sure as well, I mean, like if we want to maybe move on to the IT department, as you said, like a lot of the burden does end up with them in terms of just merging the new systems and new processes and all of that. But obviously there needs to be conversations had at a very top level, that kind of certain activities, let's say if there's IT projects ongoing, that there needs to be conversations about, well, what's a priority? Like what are we focusing on here? And so I would imagine that that's an important conversation to have, or those probably multiple conversations are important to have at that stage, to ensure that things are streamlined, or things happen really that need to happen.
Yeah, you know, in a merger, I guess, you know, both or many companies can have their own set of portfolio of projects that, you know, that a lot of them are still quite valid even post deal closure, right? I think that you need to have a very clear review of each portfolio and understand what's still critical in the near term that needs to be completed. I think for me, the integration itself, it won't be successful if you don't allocate the right level of resourcing to it. You might get there in the end, but you're definitely going to overshoot your timelines. I think having a dedicated integration team is really important, and that doesn't just mean that it's a tech team, right? It's got those stakeholders in the business, but quite often it can be helpful to consider the cost of that when you're in the due diligence and deal structuring phase as well, because it's often something that's overlooked. And you know, you can always augment your technical resources or your project management capability with you know, resources from companies like Saros, who can help drive that project forward, but also allow you to keep the lights on and keep operations as a priority. You know, I touched on the risk management component. That's really important as part of it, but understanding that true cost of integration is really important, and it has to be considered up front. Something we haven't talked about is, you know, depending on, you know, the organization that's being acquired or that's being brought into house, there could be a very small IT department there, and there may be a significant operational overhead to maintain whatever platforms are there. Obviously, your own IT department won't have any experience of those systems. You may not have a presence in the locations that you know, the acquired companies are operating. So it's always good to consider all of that when you're structuring a deal as well. And you may need to consider some form of TSA agreement that allows for operational support and coverage through and beyond the integration until you get to a point where you've consolidated your organizations and you've got those synergies and everything can be supported as one. But all of that, you know, it flows throughout the process, but it links back to that dedicated integration team, clear project plan, good risk management framework wrapped around it.
So a TSA, just for, that's a kind of a bridging scenario where you're kind of
yeah, it's a transitional service agreement that basically means that, you know, if my company is being acquired and we build a product, we sell it to our customers, you know, we ultimately maintain that platform. So if Gavin's company decides to acquire the company that I work for, his team won't have any knowledge of those systems. And, you know, from a risk perspective, my IT guys could decide, you know what, this is not for us, and we leave, and all of a sudden you've got a massive gap in your operational support capability for what you've just acquired. So that TSA agreement is something that should be baked into the structure of the deal financially, so that you don't end up with this hidden cost of, you know, all of a sudden you need to pay a significant amount of money every year to maintain what you've just acquired because you don't have the skills or the capacity.
Yeah, and transition service agreements to me should be treated like a, you know, a major vendor contract, right? Often they can be, you know, they're less of a focus from a leadership perspective, but from an IT side of things, you really need to treat it like a large vendor contract. It needs the right level of due diligence, because ultimately they tend to be expensive. And often you'll agree a TSA of 6 months, and then leadership will see the monthly cost of it and say, can you do it in 5? Can you do it in 4? And it's not just financial, there's also risks around it. So TSAs are something I've negotiated on both sides. I've never seen one of the level of detail that I'd like. And I've never seen one that we haven't been under pressure to exit early for cost. So you really do need to have, again, the right people with the right experience early, looking at those in order to make sure they're practical and can actually really ease through the process.
We have a few minutes left there, so Garrett and Marie, I'd like to ask you about the that side of things as well. So the business continuity and ensuring that, perhaps maybe if you want to look at it from, I think I was speaking to you before, Garrett, and I was struck by something you said, that a lot of organizations or senior management underestimate how much kind of bringing along of people that needs to happen in this situation. But like, that's probably true even in the business continuity situation here as well, because you don't want people to, I think Anne-Marie, you mentioned earlier on, to kind of feel resentful maybe that if they're going to lose their jobs, or that there's kind of an element there of trying to keep the engagement levels up, keep the kind of staff morale up and aid there. So maybe if you could we could round it out with a chat about that, because I think ultimately an M&A, what I'm getting from this whole conversation is it's very much a people-led situation or scenario.
It is, and I suppose to go back to something that Tom said about having independent eyes on it, I feel that's very much worth the investment, because you kind of sometimes forget that senior leadership are also caught up in these changes. They're also emotionally involved in the changes. It potentially can impact them as well. So they're going through all of these changes that all of the end users are going through. So it's always good to have an independent, non-emotionally involved group, making sure that all the plates are kept in the air. I think that's a key thing. I think another thing that people don't do, and it's a key step that people miss out, is embedding the change. So, we complete the transition, we adopt the transition, and then everybody moves on. And it's like, that's it now, everything's done and forgotten about, let's move forward. If you don't embed that change, people are habitual. If people don't have a full understanding still of what's expected of them, of how to, if there's not been adequate training about new processes and various things, people will revert back to the way they originally did things. So it's not a process that finishes once the merger finishes. It needs to have sort of regular pulse points, making sure that people are still minded, making sure that the training is still adequate, even doing anonymous surveys, things how people are feeling in the environment, because what you don't want to do is go through an expensive transition and then lose some of your key valuable staff. That creates more disruption.
Thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank you, four guys. You've been really great, and I hope the attendees managed to get some valuable insights or information from that. I'm just going to hand you back to Justin, who's just going to round it up, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Yeah, such an insightful event. Some really great points that are made. I think for anyone dealing with the IT elements of an M&A, there's some really great information in there, whether it was new information or whether it was just a refresher. There's just so much to think about when an M&A is happening. So really thank you to Deirdre for running the event. Gavin, Tom, Anne-Marie and Garrett, thanks a million for your contribution. As I say, really insightful, and it's always great to get a refresher on it. And thank you to all the guests for joining. Really appreciate the good turnout, and yeah, thank you from Saros as a whole.